Everyone experiences suffering in life. It's a universal human experience, and everyone seeks to escape their suffering through a whole variety of ways. We seek pleasure, distraction, sedation. We think, if only I had this thing or that thing, if only my circumstances were different, if I only had more money or a partner or a different partner rather than the one that I currently have. If I could change this thing or that thing, maybe then I wouldn't suffer. And some of us turn to spirituality. In fact, most people turn to spirituality because they suffer. Nothing else seems to have relieved them of their suffering, and so they turn to spirituality for relief. And even within the spiritual culture, there are all kinds of temporary escapes, all sorts of ways that we can distract ourselves or even delude ourselves so that we don't have to face our suffering. But true spirituality is not about escaping suffering. It has much more to do with facing it, learning to be with it, learning how to better deal with it. As Thich Nhat Hanh once said, when you know how to suffer, you suffer much less. You see, suffering is resistance. Resistance either to something real or imagined, but resistance nonetheless. And when we try to escape from suffering, that is also resistance. We're creating more resistance on top of the resistance that is already there. And so we tend to suffer all the more. But when we can learn to be with our suffering, to allow it space and to observe it, it decreases. When we're in the midst of suffering, we're consumed by it, and it can feel overwhelming at times. Our awareness tends to be contracted to a small point within that experience of suffering. But to observe, awareness must expand beyond that which is being observed, or to retract back from it. And when this happens, you're no longer consumed by suffering. Suffering is something which is occurring within your awareness, along with everything else, but it doesn't consume your awareness. And if you can observe your suffering, you can discover what is giving rise to it. Initially, you might think that the suffering is caused by something outside of you, by the situation or circumstance. That's why we often search for relief outside of ourselves. But suffering arises from within, in response to what may be occurring, or to what we imagine is occurring, how we perceive it, how we interpret it, how we evaluate it. In other words, it has much more to do with what we think rather than the situation itself. One of the greatest causes of suffering is our refusal to accept things as they are. A refusal to accept the reality of whatever we're presented with. Life happens in a particular way, and we refuse to accept it. We have some idea or expectation as to how we think life should be, and reality is not cooperating. Reality is not granting our wishes. Reality is not confirming our desires and expectations. And so we refuse to accept it, and as a result, we suffer. We want things that we don't have, or we have something that we don't want. Or we have what we want, but we're afraid that we might lose it. And all of this creates suffering. But don't take anything that I'm saying as a matter of fact. That is, don't assume that what I'm saying is true, even if it sounds very logical. Find out for yourself. And the only way to do that is to sit with your own suffering and to explore it. All you have to do is get curious about it. If you can see what is causing you to suffer, then you can do something about it. No one else can do that for you. You have to find out what is at the root of your own suffering. And the only way to do that is to go into it and explore it. There's no escaping it. You can distract yourself for a time, you can sedate yourself, you can turn your attention away from it. You can even fool yourself into believing that you've transcended it through some kind of self-hypnosis. But in time, the illusion wears off, the sedation wears off, the distraction wears off, and you're right back where you started, once again faced with your suffering. At some point, the only option you have left, which is really the only option you ever had, is to face your suffering and find out what is the real cause of it, because then you can do something about it. I'm not saying there isn't the possibility of getting free from suffering, but to get free of it, you have to understand it. And the only way to understand something is to turn toward it, to observe and examine it. And that requires having the willingness to be with your suffering rather than trying to escape.